Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kelly Beard, Content Specialist for Maryland Realtors. I want to welcome you all to our Maryland's Economy, Why Housing Matters webinar. Today, we have with us CEO Chuck Caskey, Director of Advocacy and Public Policy, Lisa May, and Cetera pollster, Joe Good. Together, we will dive into the 2025 housing poll results, latest legislative updates, ADUs, and the current market trends. We do encourage your questions and we look forward to answering them. Please post your questions in the Q&A box below at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will answer your questions after each speaker presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa. Lisa, take it away.
Kelly, thank you so much as always. And thanks to all of you for spending this beautiful afternoon here with us at Maryland Realtors. It's wonderful to see so many of you, Realtor members, and also our local association dedicated staff members here with us to talk about our Maryland Realtors State of Housing poll. This poll is a vital advocacy tool that we have used for the past, I believe, 5 years now, which, as Joe will tell you, gives us some very interesting trend lines. But more than that, we find ourselves in very interesting times right now. We have a lot of change, a lot of uncertainty, and it means that folks are really looking for good, reliable, truthful information about our housing market and what is occurring. And that presents us with a very valuable opportunity to really get our message out about Maryland, its housing stock, and its housing needs that we think we should all be really taking advantage of to advance our cause of providing more housing supply for our home buyers and our sellers, both of today and into the future. So we are going to first start with our wonderful information that we have received from Joe Good before we move into some other tools and other ways that you can use this to spread the word about housing. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe Good from Cetera to talk about our poll results. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. As Lisa said, this is the fifth time we've done the State of Housing poll in Maryland. And it's a great way for us to kind of quantify a lot of what you're seeing on the ground and what you're hearing. And it gives Lisa and Chuck and their team some real numbers to share with legislators and advocacy folks. It's one thing to say what I heard and have anecdotal information. That's always very valuable. But with this poll, we have a true random sample of Maryland residents, and we're asking them about both kind of how things are going in the state. Then we're going to go a little bit deeper dive into how they're perceiving housing in the market. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the asked questions about the personal impact of what's happening with housing. So let me share my screen. And we're going to go into slideshow mode, hopefully. And I'm going to start just real quick, just as a pollster. I want to let you know that the survey itself was conducted. Sorry, I'm gone back a little bit here. Let me go back to my first slide. The poll was conducted in January of 2025. As I said, we do a random sample of 800 respondents statewide. And this is done what we call with hybrid sampling. So we're both doing live phone calls to folks, primarily on cell phones, and we're also texting links to people. So a lot of folks don't like to take a poll live anymore, but they'll do the link, they'll take it on their phone, and that gives us a sample of 800, and it gives us a margin of error of plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. And again, the poll itself, the data was collected at the beginning of this year from January 6th to January 9th. And sometimes I'm going to show you over the course of the presentation references to 4 earlier surveys that we've done. I think you get a copy of the slides if you want to see all of the methodology behind that. That methodology will be there for every one of the polls. The sample is going to be representative of the state. We make sure that we have a representative sample. We set quotas by region, by age, by gender, to make sure that we're having a good sample. So, we're having about 54% women, 46% men. By party, we know Maryland leans Democratic, or 53% identify as Democrats, 24% is Republican, 23% is independents. And we make sure that we have a regional distribution and an age distribution that matches up to what we know about Maryland residents. So again, I'm going to start with just some general mood questions. Then we're going to get into some questions about housing specific and where folks see what's going on with housing, what types of housing are needed. And then we're going to measure some of the personal impact of what's going on in the housing market. So we start with what we call kind of this traditional right direction, wrong track question. You'll see the question wording will always be down here at the bottom of our slides. And this is kind of a standard warm-up question that we use in the polling industry. Generally speaking, do you think things in Maryland are going in the right direction, or do you feel things that have gotten off on the wrong track? And here you see what we call kind of our time series data. We first started asking this question back in 2020. 60% of the country felt things were going in the right direction. But then you can see as we got over the pandemic, we had a little bit of a slippage there, 49%. We went to 56%. But for the last 2 years, Maryland residents are really kind of split on the direction of the state. 46% feel like things are going in the right direction. 48% feel that things are going off on the wrong track. That's what we call a statistical tie in my business. When we can incorporate our margin of error, that means just as many people feel that things are going in the right direction as feel that things are off on the wrong track. Now, this particular question is often very driven by partisanship. So I like to break out this slide to show you that Democrats tend to think the state's going in the right direction. We have a Democratic governor, Democratic legislature. So Democrats are feeling okay about how things are going, 68% right direction, but even 26% of Democrats feel that things are off on the wrong track. Whereas our independent voters, our voters who call themselves independent, they don't lean towards Democrats or Republican, they're leaning more majority wrong track. And self-identified Republicans, they're very negative on the state direction at 81%, saying things are off on the wrong track. So again, when you add it all up together, half the state feels like things are going okay, half wrong track. Democrats are more bullish on how things are going, but independents, and that's kind of the key political group, are leaning majority wrong track, and Republicans feel things that are very much are off on the wrong track. We also see some splits by urbanicity. Our voters in urban areas, they tend to be a little more Democratic. They're a little more bullish, 53% right direction. Suburban areas are split. Our rural areas, which again tend to be disproportionately Republican, are much more wrong track. But one thing interesting we see here, when we look at our respondents who have kids versus respondents who do not have kids under age of 18, our people who don't have kids are kind of split. But we see that our people who have kids are 56% wrong track. And a lot of that is driven by housing costs and being able to afford a place to buy, a place to rent. That shows up in some other questions we're going to show you a little bit later. So the next thing in the poll, we do kind of what is an interesting question where we ask our respondents in their own words to say, what would you say is the biggest issue in Maryland that you would like the governor and the state legislature to focus on? Now, Maryland residents are all over the place on this question. There's not one issue that's really standing out, but the top two were housing affordability and taxes and property taxes. Now, again, I didn't give them a prompt here. This is kind of, they tell us in their own words what they think the top concerns are. And then my staff goes back and we read each response and we code it. This is the first time that housing affordability was volunteered as the top concern, tied for number one. Again, a statistical tie with taxes, overall tax load, and property taxes in Maryland. So that just shows you, before we even get into the poll, how big of an issue housing affordability is for Maryland residents right now. 19% talked in their biggest concern just about how hard it is to afford housing, either rentals or getting into buy housing. And in fact, it's right up there with taxes and property taxes as the most often mentioned concern. And then we have a lot of varied other concerns: crime, education, inflation, cost of living. Really, those kind of just traditional issues are mentioned kind of double digits. But there's lots of things that Maryland residents are concerned about. But the fact that housing affordability was number one, was tied for number one anyway with taxes, was something we haven't seen in our previous surveys before. And here's just to give you a sense of what those quotes look like. Here you see affordable housing, housing mortgage grants to promote home ownership for those who need down payment assistance, and programs to discourage gun violence in school. We need to be more affordable, less taxes to working people who are struggling. Down here, you see another person, affordable housing. People working previously middle-class jobs are being priced out of the market at an increasing rate, not to even mention people struggling to get by and working 2 jobs for a small bedroom, costing them $2,000 a month. So again, housing is a top-of-mind issue for Maryland voters, Maryland residents, and you can kind of see the emotion that people have when we ask them to type out their response or to give us their what they felt is their top concern. So from there in the poll, we then transition more into housing specific questions where we really want to get a sense of how people view housing affordability overall in Maryland and supply issues. And we start with a kind of a general question that we ended up changing after 2022. We say, generally speaking, would you say that the cost to buy a house in your part of Maryland is too high, about right, or too low? And you can see back in 2020, 57% said the cost to buy a home was too high. That bumped up to 71% in 2022. So at that point, I followed up people who said too high. Would you say that that's much too high or somewhat too high? And you can see that the overall too high number has gone up to 77% in 2023, 82% in 2024, and 84% this year in 2025. And look at how that intensity has also gone up. 43% said much too high in 2023, 54% said much too high in 2024, and 57% said housing costs are much too high in 2025. That's back to the total percentage. If you look back in 2020, overall 57% said housing costs was too high. Now we have 57% who say housing in Maryland is much too high. Overall, 84% saying housing is too high. So again, this is why we like to quantify this. It's one thing for everybody to say, oh, it's cost me too much to buy a house. But when 84% of the state agrees on something, that housing costs have gotten too high in Maryland, that really tells you just how prevalent this is for folks. And here's one breakout by age, which again, I think is kind of an interesting time series trend. Voters under 50, they're the dark bar here. They're always number one. They've gone from 60% to 78% too high, 81%, 87%, 87% too high. But look at how older voters have slowly kind of caught up with voters under the age of 50, to whereas this year in 2025, we have 80% of all of our age brackets, whether you're a senior citizen, whether you're between the ages of 50 and 64, or whether you're under 50, all saying that housing costs are too high in Maryland. There's really almost no difference by age anymore. Now, the other thing we want to ask about is rental. And again, we see the same trends for rental. Would you say the cost to rent an apartment in your part of Maryland is too high, too low, or about right? Again, you see that same trend. 80% of residents feel that rental costs are also too high across the state. If we break this out by some of the major counties, Prince George's, the central part of the state, Montgomery County, Anne Arundel County, or the greater Baltimore area, we see that rental costs across the state are seen as too high by most Maryland residents. Now, when we switch this a little bit to say, well, how would you rate the job being done by the governor and the Maryland State Legislature on the issue of housing affordability and supply? The answer is not so good, right? And we're also seeing when you see housing affordability is that big of a problem, you see here down at our bottom level, most folks are giving the governor and the state legislature only a just fair or poor rating job on handling housing affordability and supply. Local government's not doing much better. Again, when we say, how would you rate the job being done by your local county and city governments on the issue of how to afford housing affordability and supply, we have 77% who say our local governments are doing either a poor job at 36% and 40% a just fair job. So again, this is a number that Lisa can kind of share with our legislators when they say, oh, well, it's the state government doing a bad job. We're doing a great job here locally. That's not how the public sees it. The public does not see government being very responsive on this issue. And again, they're doing a just fair or poor job. And that's not something that our elected officials like to see. And it kind of lights a little fire under them when they see that job performance rating. So from there, we want to go into asking people, well, what about specific kinds of housing? Do you think there is too little, too much, or about the right amount of the following of each of the following kinds of housing in your part of Maryland? And we ask about a lot of different things. And what this graph is showing are just the percentage who say there is too little of that kind of housing available in their part of Maryland. And we started off here with a couple of things here. Housing for younger people and those who are just getting started in their careers in your part of Maryland. Is there too much of that kind of housing, too little, or about the right amount? 75% say there's too little housing available for younger people and those who are just getting started in their careers. The same for people with moderate and low incomes. Housing for people with low incomes, 67% too little of that kind of housing available in their part of Maryland. Housing for people with moderate incomes, 66% too little of that kind of housing available for people in their part of Maryland. And housing for older people who are looking to downsize or have special needs, 64% say there's too little of that kind of housing available. So when you kind of put a face on it and you ask respondents, well, is there too much, too little, or enough of that kind of housing available? You see that 2/3 or more say there just isn't enough housing for young people, for people with low incomes, for older people looking to downsize. And again, this is a number that is true across the state. But when we transition it into specific housing types, those numbers drop a little bit. So when we ask people, is there too much, too little, or about the right amount of single-family homes available to purchase in your part of Maryland? Well, 47% say there's too little of that kind of housing available, but it drops below this 2/3 rating. And it kind of speaks to a little disconnect that we often see among voters and residents, where they know housing prices are much too high, but they don't always see the availability problem. Recall that we had 80% saying that housing affordability is a problem, but here we see only 47% saying there's too little single-family homes available to buy. 44% say there's too little places to rent, and 32% say that there's too little new houses and apartments being built in your part of Maryland. So a little bit of a disconnect here. Folks aren't necessarily getting that supply and demand equation through their head as much as we would like, that if we're not building enough, right, we're not going to have enough housing for folks with younger people getting started in their career, that moderate and low income housing. So there is a little bit of a disconnect here that we're working to educate folks on, that we really need to be increasing that housing supply. And the Maryland Realtors have been doing a great job on that. Here's kind of that time series question. Again, this is going to be people who say there's too little housing available for people with moderate incomes. Back in 2020, it was 46%. That's kind of gone up to 66% over the years. So there is this sense that people are starting to understand that, okay, people with moderate incomes are really feeling stretched by this availability, but we really need to kind of get those numbers up in terms of housing construction starts, kind of get that supply and demand equation more into people's brains.
And Joe,
So the
really,
third part, I'm sorry.
Joe, sorry, just to interject really quickly,
Sure.
Joe was talking about the moderate income individuals in these polls and the growth that we've seen there. That has been a really big talking point for us, because there is a little joke that in a poll, everyone's middle class, or at least believes that they are. So we have used this particular point to say, these are the middle class individuals in Maryland. Middle class residents are saying there's not enough housing for people like them. And that's how we've kind of couched this to really drive home the point of this is probably a majority of Maryland here, really saying that our housing market is not providing what they need.
Right. And just to reiterate that, we do kind of put a context for low incomes and moderate incomes. And again, used to be, people like, hey, there's not enough money for low income folks, but there's no difference between our low income folks and moderate income folks, those kind of middle class housing that Lisa's talking about.
Joe, can you go back to that slide again one last time? I think you used the word disconnect, and I would probably refine that just a little bit, especially that bottom data point. the phrase in your area, in your
Mm,
part of Maryland. This is kind of like, I don't trust Congress, but I love my member of Congress, right? And
right.
so we know, and people admit and agree, there's a housing shortage. And as soon as you say, oh, well, we're gonna put, a mixed use development with, single family homes and some rental units, and it's gonna be a half a mile from your house, then you get yard signs that say no apartments, no compromise, and the NIMBYs come out. And so, yeah, I think it's one thing to say we need more housing, but that last data point says, yeah, but not here.
Yeah, and that's where you really see that NIMBY problem
Exactly.
quantified. Thanks for clarifying that, Chuck, because and that is why we phrase the question that way about in
Yes.
your part of Maryland, because we do want folks to kind of think locally as they're asking the question,
Right.
and we do have that NIMBY problem, even though folks are also willing to say there's not enough housing for middle income, moderate families in my part of Maryland.
I think it's apartments, though. I think once you introduce the concept of apartments, that gets people thinking about the other.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go into the personal impact. And here's where we want to start off by asking people how much of a financial strain on your budget is paying your rent or mortgage each month? Is it a significant strain, a slight strain, not much of a strain, or no strain at all? And again, look at these red bars here. This is the percentage of respondents who say a significant strain or a slight strain. And this just shows you just how personally impacted folks are by housing costs. Look how this has gone from 43% in 2020, saying significant or slight strain, up to 61% in 2025, 30% a significant strain, 31% a slight strain. And you can see how that intensity is up 10 points over the 5 years that we've been asking this poll. And it really just brings home how many people are just struggling with housing costs and how much that strains their personal budget, every month in housing. And if you break this out demographically, you're going to see real differences here for renters and young people. Homeowners are feeling strained as well. 50% of homeowners are either significantly or slightly strained by what they're paying in their mortgage each month. But look at our renters, 52% feeling a significant strain, 33% a slight strain, 85% of renters feeling at least, somewhat strained by what they're paying for rent. So again, you're going to see some trends here by age. The younger you are, the more strained you are by what you're paying in rent. We're also seeing some effects by race and age, where whites under 50, blacks 50 plus, and blacks under 50, all up here at 2/3 to 80% feeling significantly or slightly strained. Older whites, 43% feeling strained, but the intensity drops off a little bit because a lot of our older folks are in a house that perhaps they've already owned or paid off. So you can see how that strain does drop off. But again, look at those age and renter numbers. You can see just how strained a lot of folks are feeling about housing costs. And that has very real implications for Maryland, because we then follow up those folks who are feeling strained. We say, well, does the cost of housing in Maryland make you think about moving from your current home or not? And then if they say yes, we say, are you thinking about moving outside of the state? Or are you thinking about moving elsewhere in Maryland? Or no, or if they weren't strained at all, we didn't ask them that question. So again, you can see how back in 2020, we had 21% saying that they were thinking about moving because of the cost of housing. 15% were thinking about moving out of the state. Now look how that has gone up from 18, 22 to 23, up to almost 1/3 of our respondents are thinking about moving outside of the state because of housing costs, because of the strain of housing costs. 42% are thinking about moving somewhere, but some of those folks are thinking about just removing elsewhere in Maryland. But this just shows you how housing costs are really affecting people and could really affect Maryland moving forward. Because when you look at who these people are who are really talking about leaving the state, it's our 18 to 34-year-olds. 36% of 18 to 34-year-olds are thinking about leaving the state because of housing costs. And a lot of our folks who are in that kind of pre-retirement to think about where they're going to be in retirement, where do they want to be. 39% of age 50 to 64-year-olds are thinking about leaving the state Again, these are going to be top income earners or people who are thinking about where they're going to retiring. So this could have a real effect on Maryland's future as you look at who's thinking about moving because of housing costs. And in fact, if you look at just renters under 50, we like to get this down to just people who are currently renting. Are they thinking about, is the cost of housing making them think about leaving the state? 42% of younger folks in Maryland who currently rent are thinking about leaving the state because of the high cost of housing. This could be a lot of people who want to get in that first time home and just don't see affordability in Maryland for them, or that option of being able to get in a home. And it can just be folks who are really pressured by renters. But this is really a very upsetting figure, I think, when you look at how much our under 50 crowd is thinking about leaving the state because of the cost of housing.
Joe, we do have a question. I'll qualify the premise. This person says we do see more homes being built, and I would say to that, that's a regional issue. Yeah, when I travel around, I do see a lot of new construction in some parts, like Southern Maryland counties and whatnot. There are other parts of the state where there is very little, if any, building going on. Baltimore County, it's really hard to build anything. But problem with the price point, and we speak about this tangentially, right? So most buyers can't afford what's being built, and I think we don't address that head on, but it's inherent in everything we're talking about, right? I mean, we don't really explore the reasons for it. So we know that restrictive zoning, over-regulation of the building process, how hard it is because the NIMBYs come out and oppose every development, almost no matter how nice it is or how well planned it is. It's really hard to build more because of the burdens, regulatory and otherwise, that we put in place. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And when we do focus groups, I do a lot of focus groups on housing costs and availability. And what people tend to see is they're like, oh yeah, they're building this condominium development down there, but it's $800,000 for a 2-bedroom condominium, and it's not housing that I can afford. So to Chuck's point, they don't really think about it in terms of what are all the factors going into building that expensive condominium or that expensive single-family home. They're just seeing that construction happening, but they don't see it as housing that they can afford or that their kids can afford. So that's part of the reason that we see some of that disconnect on availability and affordability.
Yeah, thank
you. And this is a slide kind of speaks to that as well. It's a little bit busy, but let me explain it. We ask people on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 means you're not at all confident and 5 means you're very confident. How confident are you that if you had to move from your current residence, you would be able to afford or rent a different home that meets your needs in Maryland? Back in 2020, when we first started asking this question, most folks were still fairly confident that they could afford a house. That's this green bar here. These are my 4s and 5s. Like, yeah, if I had to move, I'd probably be able to find that. It was a 3.6 mean score on my 5-point scale. But now we're down to just 32% who feel like they are very or fairly confident, the 4s or the 5s. And look at how my 1s and 2s have really gone up. So we've gone from 12% not at all confident to 29% not at all confident that they could find another house in Maryland that meets their needs. So again, it speaks to just kind of that, what types of housings are available out there that people can buy as people look at the market, even from if they're homeowners right now, from their perception, they don't think they could afford a new house or a different house in Maryland that really met their needs. So the last thing that we do, we ask, again, for people, we say, look, what are the obstacles to buying a home? And we give them 5 or 6 things. We ask them, how big of an obstacle is this that makes buying a home too difficult or expensive? Is it a huge obstacle, a medium-sized obstacle, a small obstacle, or not an obstacle at all? These numbers have not changed much in the 5 years that we've been asking it. So I'm just showing you the overall things here in terms of all the obstacles that folks face in saving up and buying for that first home. A lot of these are huge obstacles. Most important, having a full-time job, but still not making enough to afford a home. 72% say that is a huge obstacle. Another 19% a medium-sized obstacle. Interest rates making the cost of loans too expensive. 65% huge obstacle. Having enough money for a down payment, 60%, huge obstacle. The high construction costs for new homes, 57%, a huge obstacle. And then you get into kind of debt from college and credit card. That's 55, 48%, huge obstacle over here, 80%, 77%, huge or medium-sized obstacle. And then finally, banks making it too hard to qualify for a home mortgage or loan, 70% call that a huge or medium-sized obstacle. So it all gets back to affordability. Having jobs that are, you're having a full-time job and still not making enough to buy a home, interest rates being problematic, and then just being able to save up for that down payment. There's a lot of barriers that our folks think that people face when buying that home. And it's also true, we did ask this of just non-homeowners. This includes renters and people who are living with family, friends. The rank order is pretty much still the same, although we see that debt from student loans goes up a little bit when we just limit it to just our renters, people who are not current homeowners. We also asked this question because it's a great talking point. We asked folks, here's an agree-disagree statement. Is it harder for young adults to afford to buy a home today than it was for their parents' generation? Do you agree or disagree with that statement? Well, 93% agree with that statement. Pretty much everybody understands that it's much harder for young adults to buy a home today than it was for their parents. And especially our folks under 50 strongly agree with that statement. Seniors also tend to strongly agree with it, although the intensity drops off a little bit. But again, 93% agree that it's harder for young adults to buy a home today than it was for their parents' generation. The other thing last question before I go to the ADU thing, we do ask if people, again, it's another one of our agree-disagree statements, we see there are too many local rules and regulations that make it hard to build homes that Marylanders can afford. And we do get 63% who agree with that statement. Not surprisingly, Republicans overwhelmingly agree with that statement, but even 57% of Democrats agree that there are too many local rules and regulations that make it hard to build homes that Marylanders can afford. 26% of Democrats strongly agree with that statement. So I think you are getting through with some of the education that I know the association has been doing. When you have 57% of Democrats agreeing there are too many rules and regulations, that means you're kind of getting through with some of that messaging. We just need to get that strongly agree number up a little bit. The last thing we've asked about are accessory dwelling units. Now, not surprisingly, we do ask people right off the top of the gate, have you heard about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and how familiar are you with them if you have heard about them? Well, most folks haven't heard that much. They're not that familiar with accessory dwelling units, but you guys have really started doing an outreach campaign on that. And we can see how people were saying they're very familiar or somewhat familiar, or even not too familiar with ADUs. That number has really gone up since 2022 when you've really started to push that to where 1/4 of our respondents are now very or somewhat familiar with ADUs. And another 15% recognize what they are, but say they're not that familiar with it. So again, making real progress on what ADUs are. And that's kind of starting breaking through a little bit to the public. We then give them a short description, say here that an accessory dwelling unit is a separate residential unit in or on a private home or property. For example, a carriage house, garage apartment, or basement apartment. These units must have their own entrance, plumbing, and kitchen facilities. So we educate them exactly what it is. And then we say, as you may know, local zoning laws often make it difficult for homeowners to have an ADU on their property. Would you favor or oppose making it easier for Maryland homeowners to have an accessory dwelling unit or ADU on their property? So once we define what it is, people are overwhelmingly supportive of the idea of making it easier for homeowners to have an ADU on their property. And this is something that's true all across the state. We get almost majorities strongly favoring the idea of making it easier for homeowners to have an ADU. And a lot of folks are over here into somewhat favor. But again, this is kind of a common sense solution that a lot of homeowners see the attractiveness of, perhaps even to themselves, making a little more money, but an easy way to kind of increase the housing inventory, providing more areas for folks to live.
Yeah. And breaking news for everyone who is attending today, the statewide ADU bill that we have been pushing and that has been promoted in this poll is actually being signed into law as we speak this afternoon. And what that bill will do, and you'll hear so much more from us on this, is that by next October 2026, each local government needs to enact a local ordinance that allows for the construction of ADUs in single-family zoned areas. So as this sort of switches from a state level discussion and down into your local communities, we will be providing you with much more information and resources on how to make those ADU ordinances as strong as they can possibly be, so that as many homeowners who want to can take advantage of this new housing option that we have for our residents.
I always wanted to also, give a shout out. Cheryl Abrams Davis, our Maryland Realtors president, is at the bill signing ceremony. Normally, a lot of us would be there, but we're here. So Cheryl is, I guess Krista's with her, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, she's gonna, and we'll share the photos from that, because it's a pretty big deal. So thank you.
Great news. So that's the poll. Just to recap real quick, and then we'll see if there's any questions. I know it's a lot of data, and again, I believe the graphs are available to you to look in a little more detail if you want to geek out a little bit. But your big takeaways: housing affordability, big problem, a top issue, a volunteered issue from our respondents for the first time, tied for number one with taxes. Households are increasingly strained by housing costs. You saw how that percentage of people feeling significantly strained by housing costs has gone up to 60%, with almost a third saying significantly strained. Our state and local officials are getting just so great on handling housing affordability and supply. 2/3 say there's too little housing available for people with moderate incomes. We also see lots of folks saying there's too little housing for young people, lower income people, and seniors. So as you're talking about the housing shortage, it's always a little more powerful to put a face on it and let your elected officials, as you're talking to your local folks, really understand who it is who's not able to get into that house, get into that first house. It's always helpful to kind of put a face on that. When we think about the obstacles of what it's stopping people from getting into that first time home or moving up home, wages not keeping up with housing prices, trouble saving for a down payment, increased interest rates were our top obstacles. But as we all know, there's lots of obstacles that folks are facing when buying a home. We did see that voters agree that there are too many regulations that are making it hard to build affordable homes. That's another one that you can share with your local elected officials as you're out there talking with folks. Even Democrats think there's too many rules and regulations when it comes to housing construction. And again, young people have it much harder than their parents. And we have seen the increased familiarity with ADUs. And now we're going to have the option to hopefully put some of that into effect. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to look over here on the
There are some
question.
good questions. First, I have a couple myself.
Sure.
One's more of an observation. People still identify high interest rates as a huge impediment to home ownership. And while on the one hand, I don't disagree with that, I do, however, think we need to do a better job of explaining to people that even in today's interest rate environment, interest rates are historically low. And I think part of the problem is a perception issue, and we haven't done a good enough job of explaining to people how addicted we got to artificially low interest rates. And an entire generation thought, I'm going to get a 2.5% mortgage. And if it's anything more than that, then I'm paying too much. The fact of the matter is that over the last 40 years, the average interest rate is 7.7%. Now, yeah, that includes the ups and downs, but it's historically, we are in a very moderate interest rate environment, not an extremely high historically, 40 years worth, 7.7%. So I think rates went down. They're back up over 7% or just about that this week. I don't track it as much as closely as our members do, but I do think that that's an issue. We should do better at explaining to people that it should not infect the timing of their purchase. Some of us do a better job than others, but I think we should stress that more. And the other thing is more for Lisa before we go on to answer the attendees' questions. When are the legislators going to get this message? So we know, especially given this year's results, that they are held in very low regard, both at the state and local level, for their attention or lack thereof. And then they passed a good bill last year. The ADU bill passed this year, but the real housing bill that we were supporting, that the governor proposed, was so watered down by the entrenched interests, and by that I mean local governments for the most part, that the governor said, never mind, it's not even my bill anymore, and nothing passed. Yes, ADUs passed. We are very proud of that, but even that was watered down to a certain amount. And so I think the question is, how do we convert the public sentiment to a sense of urgency on the part of state and local elected officials?
No, you hit the nail on the head, Chuck. There is almost this bubble that occurs in the General Assembly. Local governments do not, at least, view land use and housing as their purview. So they don't want to see anyone come in and try to tinker with it or weaken it or take it away. And so many of our state elected officials were once local elected officials. So they are, I think, sensitive to that argument. But both of those groups are incredibly out of touch with what we see in Joe's poll results, which is that Maryland residents, their constituents, are asking for housing solutions, and they don't believe that their government representatives are providing them. And it really is as simple as that. Now, in the past, we've asked that question, I believe, Joe, as long as we've had this poll, like, what do you think that your government representatives are doing a good job? And so far, we've been a little reluctant to point that out. Like, yes, it's there, but you don't necessarily want to, I guess, criticize the hand that feeds you, at least in the beginning. But now, when there is still so much hand-wringing and delay and everything against solutions that have been proven to work over and over again in states throughout the country, red states, blue states, rural states, urban states, coastal, middle, these aren't new solutions anymore. You're not breaking new ground here. Now you're just really, denying reality, I think, with this. So from our standpoint at the state, we think it may be time to really hammer that point home now, to really say, this is not what your voters, the people you represent, this is not what they want. They want action from you. And I think that that's really where we are going to start putting our focus at the state level, and our local associations and all of you can really help us spread that message in your interactions with them, in your interactions with the public, with the media, and all of those groups, that it really is time. If you care about Maryland and our future, this is an area you need to be active in.
If I might add to that, Lisa, you can also, I think, hold up national, the presidential results at some level too, where President Trump did much better with voters under 30 than he had in the past. And there's a lot of data to suggest that some of that was driven by housing costs, and just especially for the kind of under 25 crowd, and just how expensive housing has gotten. And then just, frustrated folks who want to buy a home and just not seeing anything happening on that. So that's another way to get politicians' attention, is when, people start losing office or losing constituencies over an issue. I think it's another thing that is evidence of what you're talking about. One other question I did see here too was the survey sample size was 800. And the margin of error was plus or minus 3.4 percentage points. And there was another question about, was any consideration given to the changing family size, i.e. smaller, delay having children, no children? We did not ask about that in this poll. I have recently did a poll for GCAR in DC where we did explore that issue a little bit. And that is, there's definitely a perception in the district anyway of that being a real problem, that just as some families are smaller and homes that are built more for smaller households, that is on the radar in the district poll that we did, but we didn't ask about that in this survey, but maybe we'll think about that in the future.
So I
Yeah,
want
and
to
one thing
address-
that has been something that has been asked, oh, sorry, Chuck. That's one thing that has been asked by NAR in their annual survey of buyers and sellers. This hasn't been something that we've talked about yet in this webinar, but it is a good resource. There are a growing percentage of people who are looking for intergenerational or multi-generational homes. I believe that has gone up from somewhere in the 8 to 10% a few years ago to now closer to 17 to 20% of people are looking for multi-generational housing options. I'm sure that some of that is price and supply, but some of it too is where, that's kind of where ADUs fit in that sweet spot of here is, you can have grandma in the ADU and the family in the main house, or maybe it allows an older individual to age in place by having a caregiver in the ADU. So those types of housing options are being sought more often, but they aren't necessarily what can and does get built based upon the regulations that we have at the local level.
Yeah, that's a good segue because there's a question about specifically what are the rules and regulations causing restrictions. We don't have that kind of time. Let's start with the big one. The elephant in the room is single family zoning. I think it's the consensus among the academic, not just academics, but people of all kinds who are looking at the way land use has developed in the United States writ large, and certain places more than others. The ability to exclude, the desire to exclude certain people from attaining housing during the flight from the cities to the suburbs. We created a very inefficient land use regimen. We created a car-dependent type of living, almost because of single-family zoning. The lack of ability to put housing of different kinds everywhere has really almost singularly created this crisis. And so not only that, but a development of any kind, of any size, has to go through so many hoops, jump through so many hoops, whether it's adequate public facilities and ordinances. And I'm not saying all of this should go away. I'm just saying zoning and planning are two different things. You can have planning. We would never want, a swine rendering plant in the middle of a residential neighborhood. That's not what nobody is saying that. But what we are saying is the inability to offer many types of homes everywhere has been an impediment. And the number of other regulations on everything, whether it's school capacity, which people overblow, road capacity, water, sewer, recreation and parks, police, everything. What happens then is every development, have you followed any development, this is true. 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, you're on the 3rd or 4th round of public hearings. The developer goes back and redoes the development to try to address the concerns of the constituents of the local governments that are making this decision. And the next thing you know, another round of public hearings has to happen. And now we're 2 years later than that. And so there are dozens of them. Dozens of specific rules and regulations that have been an impediment to building any housing at all, much less the housing that we desperately need. So, we had a lot of work to do, and the local governments have 75 years to fix this problem, and instead they exacerbated it. They created it and they keep it and they keep perpetuating it. And it won't get better until, to my other point, local and state elected officials understand it, have the spine to do something that their constituents might not find all that palatable, but because they do it because it's the right thing to do.
And Chuck mentioned it, it's not only just the regulations, it's the regulatory uncertainty. That was something we heard from the home builders in this year's General Assembly, is that they can't come into Maryland and know, if I do X, Y, and Z, my housing development will get approved and I can move forward. It's, if I do X, Y, and Z, I might be able to move forward, but they may also throw A, B, and C on me at the last minute. And as we're competing with other states for these national home builders in many cases, are they going to invest millions of dollars in Maryland, not knowing if they can move forward, if they will ever get a house built, when they could go to a neighboring state or some other part of the country and know for certain, if I meet these criteria, my development will get built? And that was a discussion that really started to take place this session. I don't think we've heard the last of it, but it really is one that we should consider, you know, moving forward, and something that we continue to really discuss and bring up in these housing conversations. All right, going back through here. We had just a couple of comments, you know, problems getting homes rehabbed, homes that have tax liens and have built up tax debts over time. You know, we hear about that. Some of the properties in Baltimore and elsewhere, septics and drain fields being a big impediment to housing growth in those areas. All of those very true. And really a reminder that we have to take a multifaceted approach to housing. It's not going to be just one thing that, boom, we can do this one thing and our housing problems are solved. It's going to take a whole lot of smaller incremental approaches to make our housing problems be better. Joe, has there been any adjustment made in the poll for the fact that people will always say gas, food, and housing, too high, too expensive, because those are their main day-to-day costs of living?
Well, that's why we like to ask some of the intensity measures, follow-ups. I think that I showed a couple of those, especially for the housing example, where, yeah, I mean, a lot of folks are always going to feel stressed by the basics. But when we start adding in some of those, you know, much too high, very too high, that's why we like to do those intensity measures. And when you see how those have all increased over the last 5 years, I think that speaks to some of that, just how prevalent concerns over housing and costs have become, not just perhaps for the usual suspects, what you might say, you know, folks who are, you know, on the lower part of the income scale, but for, you know, middle income and even upper income families.
Very good.
Yeah, I guess,
Let's
and
see here. Oh,
the
go
one
ahead, Chuck.
on the NIMBYs, I think I would go back to the survey results that Joe mentioned, where if you bring this up, then there's slight, you know, approval, but then when you explain it, the overwhelming number of people support it. So I think part of it is educating what are the current residents of what an ADU actually is and how it can benefit them. Doesn't mean they have to do it. And Lisa can talk to how many are actually built in these places. And again, going back to another thing Lisa said, none of this is new. None of this is groundbreaking. As a matter of fact, Maryland, for all its notoriety as a progressive state, we are so far behind the curve that than many other states and cities around the country. We are making only very small incremental progress, whereas other states and cities are taking very large, dramatic steps and having an impact on housing availability, which, as we know, then affects affordability. So, yeah, I think handling the NIMBY drama on ADUs is by and large, first step is education. And then ultimately getting a few built, and then we can actually see progress, move the needle. Then we can point to these successes and say, oh, guess what? And I love the comment, school capacity is overrated. Of course it is. People rely on it whenever you talk about density or building new housing. Oh, what about the schools? What about the roads? We test for all that stuff. And guess what? A lot of these are overrated. Sometimes local governments, they don't want to redistrict. They have excess school capacity that they don't utilize because they know how hard it is to redistrict. And if you guys know this as well as anybody, you sell a house in a certain school district, which we tell you not to because they could very easily be redistricted to another school district and then blame you for it. And so, a lot of this is noise. And a lot of it doesn't have anything to do with the actual public policy that could get us real results. So education is key. That's why we do these surveys. That's why we love when Joe comes on and explains some of the nuances. And again, love that we have this timeline now and we can see 5 years of how these results have trended over time, and we're going to keep doing it. And eventually they're going to have to listen, because every election we're going to hold their feet to the fire, just like we are with local governments and their ADU ordinances this fall. We will be on this. And so education is the first step.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing a more questions about ADUs. We will be answering those. We have I'll put in a plug right now for our session wrap-up webinar that's coming up next month. And more as we dig into all of the policy details. Yes, ADUs on septic, writing the state ADU regulations with some of those jurisdictions which have allowed ADUs already and how we bring those into compliance. We're going to have a whole lot to talk about, as Chuck said, over the coming, weeks, months to a year-ish on how we make all of that work. But because we are coming up on our hour here, I did want to provide a few other resources that we think might be helpful as we talk about our poll results and talk about housing needs in your area. So let me just quickly share my screen here. And if I can get the slideshow to come up, here we go. As we mentioned at the top, right now, people are clamoring for reliable information about the housing market, because I'm sure, as all of you know, there was a lot of misinformation circulating around in the first quarter of this year, particularly as it relates to the greater DC housing market. So this is something now that Bright is putting out, not just monthly housing stats, but weekly housing stats on these jurisdictions in and around our nation's capital. You can see that the Maryland counties down here are at the bottom half of the page, including those that are immediately adjacent to the DC border, but also Anne Arundel and Howard County, to really give as up-to-date information as is possible on what is really happening in real estate here in DC. Chuck, I didn't know if you wanted to talk briefly about that, since you've been in close contact with Bright as they've undertaken this.
Yeah, I think first of all, we wanted to make sure that we put in a plug for them, because again, we just don't know. And I think these data points help us understand, especially in the metro. I mean, I think obviously this has broader application to places like Frederick County and some other places that are Frederick County on this list. I can't really.
They are.
Oh, they are, yes. So the greater metro, remember, so we're not expecting this to necessarily apply statewide, but in those counties most affected, we're gonna see some trends over the next couple of months. The answer is we just don't know what that's gonna be. there are a couple things that kind of surprised me here on like Howard County saw a large increase in new listings. Not really sure how. And I think we have to keep this in perspective because people, even if they've been laid off, for example, I think we have to remember they're not necessarily just going to move, which originally we thought, oh, listings were going to spike, people were going to leave. Well, but then they're locked in. If they have a lower interest rate, speaking of interest rates, you know what the lock-in effect has affected you all in terms of inventory. People just don't see the need to get out of a 2.5% or 3% mortgage to get a 7% mortgage, even if they're downsizing. The other thing we need to keep in mind is a lot of people moved because they could work remotely. Remember, West Virginia was offering $30,000. Come to West Virginia, we have good Wi-Fi, and you can work in the woods and live this happy bucolic life. And now those people have to come back to work, and a lot of people aren't, but still some people are. So, I know a member who was on the call a little while ago, and he said that 2 people had reached out to him looking to buy back in the area because their work from home deal was changed. And so now they're buyers in the same market where some are sellers. So I think this is a very dynamic environment we're in. We're not making any predictions. Don't believe anybody when they tell you they know what's coming, because they don't. But I want to applaud Bright for putting this online every week. And we'll get some trends after a couple months. We'll actually see some, once we see some trend lines, right, Joe? That's what we look for, right? So, yeah, that's all. But I did want to give Bright that shout out because I think it is valuable information.
Absolutely. And now we're going to get into a couple of the resources that we have here at Maryland Realtors. We have an infographic, which is a summary of the key points of Joe's poll that we have put together. It's front and back, really highlights the approval ratings of ADUs. It highlights, and yes, we also included those approval, disapproval ratings of local governments on there in case you need to share those and spread the word on that. But then also some of the 5-year trend lines are on the reverse side. This is available on our website for download. We have some hard copies, I believe, left that we've taken out to some of our trade shows. But this is a very easy thing to hand to an elected official if you happen to be meeting with them, to show at a glance, here is what Marylanders think about housing today. So we encourage you to use this. We also have a full resource page on accessory dwelling units that we developed during the session. And once this bill is official signed into law, we will continue to add to this resource page up until and perhaps even through all of our local governments have implemented their new local ordinances. So please check back there and we will continue to highlight what we have. But you can find the ADU task force recommendations, links to the bill text, links to our talking points, videos on ADUs, and another, just host of resources that we have to really promote this new, wonderful, we think significant form of housing that we hope to grow in the future here in Maryland. And we've also created another video, and it really relates to real estate's place in Maryland's economy. That was something that we tried to drive home a lot this session, given our state's budget challenges, the search for revenues, and basically our stagnant state economy, if we're being very blunt about it. Maryland's economy is not growing at the rate of the national growth or of our surrounding states. And it is our thought that it's because our housing industry is not growing. Our housing supply is not growing. NAR puts together a one-pager, which you can see through this QR code, about real estate's contribution to the state economy. And they actually just updated this even after we did our video to show that now we're at $137,000 in economic activity from a single home sale. Now, with our number of sales being down compared to other years, we were more in the 80,000 sales, per year. We're now more in the 60s or so. Multiply that out. Multiply out $137,000 for those missing 20,000 real estate transactions. That's over $2 billion of economic activity that we are not realizing in Maryland because we are not seeing the level of home sales that we typically would. And supply is part of that. That is a message that we sort of tried out this session that we're going to continue to push, along with Joe's poll results, that our economy really is dependent upon having adequate housing supply. Because if we don't have it, our workforce, those young renters, those moderate income people, they will look elsewhere. So how are we going to find the workforce of today and the workforce of tomorrow and attract companies and jobs to Maryland if we can't house those workers? Something for all of us to consider, but especially our policymakers at the state and local levels. This graph is another way to make that argument. This actually came from the governor's housing bill, which was at first known as the Housing for Jobs Act, again, making that link between employment and housing and economic success. While the bill didn't pass, that doesn't mean that this information is bad at all. It doesn't mean that we can't use it in our local advocacy. So what this shows is the administration took the number of jobs in each of these regions or counties and divided it by the number of housing units. And so if there were more than 1.5 jobs per housing unit, essentially what DHCD was saying is you have a gap. You are not providing the housing that you need for your workforce, and you need to do something about that. Now, I'm sure that those of you who are here from Southern Maryland or Western Maryland or the Eastern Shore will say, what do you mean? Of course we have a housing shortage. Why is this number 0? This was one measure. It didn't take into account housing size. It didn't take into account housing cost. Those of you in vacation areas, it didn't take into account whether those housing units were actually available for a local resident to live in or whether they were a short-term rental or someone's second home. It's a data point. It's a data point, but one that those of you where there is a shortage on this chart can certainly make the case that we aren't meeting the needs of our workers based upon this. And this is one of my favorites. I like to play around with this from time to time. This is the Paycheck to Paycheck database from the National Housing Conference. You can go into this database and select a metropolitan area, whether it's DC, whether it's Baltimore, Salisbury, Southern Maryland, and you can look up what typical jobs, what they make. Compare that to what your median or average or starter home cost is in your area, and you can pretty quickly determine whether you have housing to meet the needs of any profession. And in case you are wondering, yes, you can look up whether a real estate agent or a real estate broker can afford a home in the area where they're selling. But like Joe mentioned, first responders, teachers, nurses, You know, those feel-good professions, are those individuals able to afford a home in your area or whatever employment sector your area needs, where you have a shortage of workers? Well, part of the reason why you might have a shortage is because they can't afford to live there and they're looking somewhere else. So love this database for, you know, if those of you who are nerds and love these sort of things, go check it out. Go play around with it and see what you can find. And then, as I mentioned, our video on Maryland's economy and what we have termed Maryland's economy begins at home, really to drive home the fact that, yep, housing and the economy are linked. We're not going to help one unless we help the other, which is where we have been. And of course, as we've mentioned all along, there are a number of ways that you can take action with the tools that we have provided to you here. We've been very fortunate at Maryland Realtors that Dan Petrell and his communications team, when we put out a press release on our monthly housing stats, there is always a quote or an explanation as to why those numbers are what they are, that point back to Joe's housing survey results or some of the talking points that we have on the economy or accessory dwelling units of that nature. Because if the press is going to pay attention to the stats, you might as well go ahead and put that policy angle right in there as well. And you can do that with letters to the editor, with your testimony at your county boards and commissions and councils, in your meetings with elected officials, or as these ADU ordinances or other housing options come up, you could run a campaign that ties the success or defeat of that measure to the economic issues and the housing supply shortage issues that we're experiencing here. So with that, we'll go back for another round of questions for all of you. And I will stop sharing so that we can take a look at those. Oh, I just see that Kelly has been putting wonderful links in there for all of you as well. Thank you,
Sure.
Kelly.
Yeah, one of the QR codes wasn't working apparently, if I could.
Oh,
got that
okay.
right, but she sent the link in, so the ADU.
Perfect.
page
And
will-
we can send all of that out to you.
I see people kind of hopping off. We'll give you a couple more seconds. We did answer the questions that were posted as we went. There are some additional videos and links, and of course, this has been recorded and it will be available within the next day or so. I will just remind everybody, if you did join with a transcription service, I saw several on Otter, and that is illegal in Maryland. And we can, by virtue of recording, we agreed to be recorded, but nobody else did. So you cannot record. We are a dual party state, so you're not allowed to record people in Maryland without everyone's consent. And that's why we took those transcription services out of the webinar. Just a heads up, if you are in a meeting and you're using Otter, for example, that people paying attention should be removing that from these meetings. So just a little sidebar. Some additional links. Thank you, Kelly. Are these links available on the recorded version? I don't remember.
All the links will be sent out with the follow-up email to all registrants.
Perfect,
So
thank you. Excellent.
they can also be found on our ADU page. We have a resource list on the side of that ADU page that a majority of them can be found on too.
Great, thanks, Kelly. All right.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks, Joe.
I'm not.
Really
Oh, go ahead,
appreciate
Chuck.
your time. It's been a great relationship. We're really happy to have established this with you, and we're going to keep going because this is really important stuff, and we're going to keep on it. We had a bad session as far as the governor's bill not passing, but we're going to keep the pressure on with everybody's help, and yeah, let's fight the good fight. So thanks everybody for joining and staying on as long as you did, and there are more to come, so stay tuned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.